Well, good morning, everyone, from the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell from the United States Air Force Academy. My name is Professor Aubrey Davis. I'm the Director of Law and Emerging Technology, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first annual, for this academic year, the 23-24 academic year, our first technology and warfare paper series. We're happy and very, very greatly honored to introduce Dr. Brian Patrick Green, PhD, who is the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University in sunny California. He teaches AI ethics in Santa Clara's Graduate School of Engineering, and he's authored a number of articles and books. Highlights include authoring the book Space Ethics, which he's actually going to be talking about today, the chapter 6 of that book, which we had provided folks an advanced copy of. He is the co-author of Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies, an international roadmap for the ITEC. He's also co-author of the Ethics in Technology Practice, Corporate Technology Ethics Resources, co-editor of the book Religious Transhumanism and its Critics, and co-editor of the special issue of the Journal of Moral Theology on AI. Dr. Green has worked extensively with the World Economic Forum, Partnership on AI, the Vatican, various levels of government and big technology, including Microsoft, Salesforce, and IBM, which companies represent over a $5 billion market cap. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Green, and thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today, sir.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. So thank you for the invitation. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about defining law and ethics at the space frontier and what some of the difficulties are with that. This is just a look at the cover of my book. So the course chapter 6 from this was sent out to you. So you don't need to have read it, but if you did, then you'll know a little bit more about what I'm going to talk about. So just a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. We'll go through the introduction, we'll talk about borders, enforcement, and kind of the nature of ethics itself, and then we'll just wrap that up. All right, so some introductory definitions. Space ethics is the branch of applied ethics which considers good action and character in the context of space and Earth as a planet in space. And space law would be the branch of law that considers legality and legal action in the context of space and Earth as a planet in space. Now, the interesting thing about space, of course, is that it has limited or no borders, legal jurisdictions from Earth and with territorial airspace. In other words, once you get up a certain level in the atmosphere, not necessarily clear exactly what that level might be, it becomes kind of doesn't belong to anyone. It's not anyone's territory. It's no one's jurisdiction. However, vessels and structures that are within that space still belong to the sending nations, and that's according to the Outer Space Treaty. This makes jurisdiction a very different environment right now. Now, borders in or on orbit, there are a lot of variables to think about. So low Earth orbit, geostationary or geosynchronous orbit, what kind of orbit are we talking about? Is it close to the Earth? Is it far away from the Earth? Is it a planetary orbit? Is it around Earth, or is it around a different planet? Is it a lunar orbit around the moon? Is it a solar orbit around the sun? Is it a galactic orbit so that it's outside of the solar system? And then orbits come in a wide variety of shapes, angles, ellipses, various sorts of eccentricity. What altitude is the orbit at? What angle is it in terms of inclination to the equator of the object it's going around, or whatever, or other designated points you would be comparing it against? Then there are Lagrange points, which are points of gravitational balance in a two-body system. So there's points, if you have the Earth and the Moon, for example, L1 would be between the two, L2 would be on the opposite side of the Moon, L3 would be on the opposite side of the Earth from the Moon, and then L4 and L5 would be the forward and trailing 60-degree angles. So you have all these sorts of different places that things can be, but nobody exactly has jurisdiction over them right now. And it's not necessarily clear exactly what all the rules are that should be around them. The Outer Space Treaty covers them for all countries that are party to those treaties. But the one thing that they all have in common is that they're conceptually, technically, ethically, and politically complex enough that they need to be classified, monitored, and maintained in an orderly manner, and it requires an innovative system to do this, especially at the legal level. So we're currently developing this system ever since the 1960s, when the Outer Space Treaty was developed. So we have a lot of things to consider when we're talking about orbits and jurisdiction in orbit and things like that. Now, laws should be ethical, and that which is ethical should be possible, because of the general rule that ought implies can. You can't do something, you can't have a should or something that you ought to do if it's just impossible for you. And then possibility is always grounded in reality and in our understandings and delineations of reality. So unclear physical boundaries therefore lead to unclear moral boundaries, which lead to unclear legal boundaries. Until we can clarify and agree upon those boundaries, then things will become clear. So for example, on Earth, there have been, all through history, people have been struggling over territory back and forth. Nowadays, we have pretty clear borders in most places on Earth, not in every place, of course, because there are still many territorial disputes that exist. So borders in space. Current regulatory agencies cover the orbits, they can cover communication, but as space becomes more and more crowded, competition is going to increase in both scale and in type. And as competition increases, the clarity of the borders and the believability of the enforcement is going to become critical. What do we mean by believability? We got Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers. Probably not going to be the most effective enforcers in space, but if interplanetary distances make good neighbors, or fences make good neighbors, or however you want to think about it, when delineations are unclear, it's hard to know when to start shooting. The Outer Space Treaty is clear, though. Space is for peaceful purposes. There's no shooting allowed. But then you get to the question, says who and who's going to make you? That is the enforcement question. So if we're talking about enforcement, if a crime is committed, for example, on the International Space Station, which was a controversy that happened a few years ago, actually, it turned out it was a false allegation. But enforcement depends on the timeliness of the detection. Do they detect it while it's on the station or when the person has come back to Earth? It depends on the type of the crime. Is it a very minor crime, or is it something very important? So severity matters. Jurisdiction, whose module is it in? And this is pretty important, because if the sending nation has control over the structure that they put up there, then it's their jurisdiction on that particular module. And effectively going between modules is kind of like crossing a border. It depends on the community judgment. What do the people in the community actually think about this? And the community might be the folks who are on the ISS, and of course it would include folks off the ISS also, because you can't stay up there forever. And there's also the ground crew and folks like that. And ultimately, it could depend on force, because that is how laws are made effective. And then the question is, what exactly is being enforced? There's the Outer Space Treaty, there's international law, and the laws of the sending country. Now, the fascinating thing, of course, about planting the US flag on the moon is that it did not claim the moon for the United States. That is against the Outer Space Treaty. However, the flag itself belonged to the moon, belonged to the United States, which is kind of an interesting thing. You can own the objects, but not the ground that they're planted in. So if the OST rules are broken, enforcement is a matter of the nation in question. In other words, it's voluntary. What if they're uninterested in enforcing the law? And the Outer Space Treaty also does not cover a lot of new and more relevant topics, which is definitely worth considering. For example, let's call it space littering. Littering is pretty common on Earth. For a long time, it's been common in space, and it was formerly accepted in both places. So it used to be, if you're just, tossing out biodegradable stuff on Earth, it doesn't matter. Littering wasn't a problem. Once you're tossing out non-biodegradable stuff, then it becomes a problem. And in orbit, however, it turns out that things don't degrade very fast at all. They can stay up there for decades, centuries, and even a very small object can cause large damage. So this is from the space shuttle. This picture here was a window pit that they got from a fleck of paint. And that fleck of paint just happened to be moving at kilometers per second velocity. And so it caused significant damage to the windscreen. So possibly something that was formerly acceptable has now become something that's more like a crime. So for example, dumping dangerous objects on a freeway if you go around dumping cinder blocks on the freeway or other large dangerous objects, you're going to get in trouble for it. And possibly that's something that we should be concerned about in orbit. Actually, more than possibly, we should be very concerned about it. And then you get into questions like, well, what if somebody intentionally creates a bunch of debris in orbit and it's not explicitly banned in the Outer Space Treaty? So November 2021, the Russians had an anti-satellite test, and you can consider this to be a kind of profligate littering for political signaling. And of course, what were they signaling exactly? Well, they were signaling deterrence. Don't mess with us because we can blow up satellites. And of course, within just a few months, they had invaded Ukraine. And there could be some clear signals that were sent there towards, for example, Elon Musk or the United States or other nations with satellites that we can cause chaos in orbit if we so desire. So of course, deterrence, what's the purpose of deterrence? You can convince bad actors not to act badly in the first place. That would be nice. But deterrence can also come from bad actors towards good people in order to make them not oppose them. So it works both within legal jurisdictions and beyond legal jurisdictions. So Russia's anti-satellite test attempting to provoke fear among those who might oppose Russia. And that's despite Russia, of course, not having a legitimate claim to jurisdiction over the entire world. But everybody has to listen to deterrence because that is what deterrence is. Deterrence is fear. And if you fear something, then you try to avoid having that bad thing happen. So under situations of strong deterrence, enforcement can almost become superfluous. The power differential makes it clear that fighting is not worth it. If bad actors know that they're going to be caught and severely punished, they might be deterred from acting badly. And if good actors, once again, fear the repercussions of doing good, then they're not going to do those good things. However, both assume that there are some clear boundaries of good and bad actions, and that's exactly what space does not have yet. So unclear borders yields unclear deterrence. And Russia has an expertise at liminal competition and warfare that benefits it well in space. They're quite willing to exploit this kind of skill that they have. And this is a lesson that people should learn because we're going to see more of it, no doubt. Of course, beyond deterrence, preventing the need for enforcement, there's also actual enforcement when laws and norms are broken. And this requires forced violence and perhaps even war. So space defense and war. Lack of clear boundaries makes just war theory difficult to apply. Of course, if you look at the chapter of my book, it has a little section in there on just war. But basically, the objective behind the book is just to give people hints of what all the tools are that they can use to apply to certain situations that they might encounter if they're thinking about these questions of space ethics. And so just war is there just to think about what should be some things to consider when considering space warfare. So, for example, just cause could be very complicated. Has a person actually broken a rule which justifies a response? Is it actually the last resort? Because if the borders are unclear, it's unclear whether they have crossed a boundary, which is your kind of last resort option, or are there other options you should take short of moving towards violence or destruction of property? Non-combatant discrimination becomes very difficult if you're talking about something like the Kessler syndrome, where if you start blowing up satellites, then it could cascade into something much worse, and in which case non-combatant discrimination would be violated, as well as proportionality. And of course, all three jus post bellum criteria are probably violated by this also in terms of restoring political, social, and environmental peace if the entire Earth is surrounded by a cloud of debris. This is partly due to dual use problems and the high energy space environment. Now I just see that a couple things are coming up in the chat. All right. So I'm just taking a look at those quickly. All right, so yes, absolutely. If you have questions, please put those into the Q&A. Moving on to, so ethical tools are used to clear up ambiguities. One of the things that these kind of ethical and conceptual tools do is they can help you think about a problem in a way that makes it possible to solve that problem. So these conceptual tools should help to illuminate where justifiable limits might be on behavior, but they also need to be connected to the specifics of space itself. In other words, what orbit do they relate to, or what planetary surface, or what lunar surface? All these specifics of space need to be set up very carefully, and people need to agree on them so that the enforcement will have greater efficacy. Once normative and legal expectations are clear with respect to space, then deterrence and defense can gain more legitimacy and efficacy. So there are many tools to draw on. Like I said in the book, I try to provide a lot of tools. This is just a list of them. There are actually more than just these, and some of these show up in multiple places. What I'm going to talk about right now are just the ones that are kind of underlined here. And of the ones that are highlighted in green, those show up in chapter 6 with a little discussion about them. They show up in other places in the book too, which is why virtue ethics and justice and resource allocation show up earlier on this list. This is kind of a chronological order of the list and order of which they appear in the book. So just quickly, we'll talk a little bit about dual-use technologies. A dual-use technology is one that has both peaceful and violent use, or a good and a bad use, depending on how you want to think about it. There's a special threat in space due to the energies and fuels and speed involved. So, of course, anything that's going orbital velocity in low Earth orbit is going to be moving at kilometers per second velocity. So just extraordinarily fast. Anything moving faster than 3 kilometers per second is equivalent to its own weight in explosives and chemical explosives. So anything going 3 kilometers per second is the equivalent of getting hit by the equivalent weight of explosives blowing up on you. And anything above that is just going to be even more violent explosives. So there's an old Latin dictum which says abusus non tollit usum. Abuse does not remove use. In other words, if you have a knife, just because a knife can be abused doesn't mean that we should not have knives in the world. The legitimate use is not vitiated by the illegitimate use. And so we can say to ourselves, okay, that's good in space. Then we can take these benefits of these dual use technologies and hopefully put some sorts of limits on the bad use. But that doesn't mean that we can't have satellites at all, just because somebody might intentionally make some satellite orbits intersect with each other. However, there are some contemporary technologies where we might want to think about this more carefully, particularly technologies with potential for catastrophic misuse, perhaps synthetic biology or nanotechnology, which could be particularly bad at replicating itself, eating the ecosphere, for example, global ecophagy scenario. All these sorts of bad ideas have come up. And they've raised this question. Maybe abusus non tollit usum only applies to certain sorts of technologies. And then we might think about the risk equation, that risk equals harm times probability. If the harm is too high, then maybe even a very low probability is not acceptable. And so we can try to figure out how to perhaps limit the uses of technologies to really make sure that probability is as acceptably low or as close to zero as possible. However, we're going to talk in a minute about why that is also difficult. So just for an example of dual use technologies in space, people have been working on ideas for how to divert asteroids away from hitting the Earth for a long time, because obviously we don't want to be hit by an asteroid. That would be very bad. Of course, it depends on the size, of course. The bigger it is, the worse it would be. However, the exact same technology which could cause an asteroid or could allow us to divert an asteroid away from the Earth could also be used to intentionally divert an asteroid towards the Earth, which of course would be a very bad use. And so this same technology of being able to direct asteroids in certain directions is a dual use technology. It can be used either for good or for bad purposes. And so we might ask ourselves, how do we actually control this sort of technology then? It seems like this is a technology which could affect everyone on Earth. Therefore, everyone on Earth should probably have some sort of say in its use. And that means some sort of governance system, which would apply to, somehow include most of the people on Earth. And of course, various scenarios are run on this periodically, where, folks gather in a room and scenario plan this sort of thing. So if we're talking about getting beyond the law, then we have to think about enforcement beyond the law. Just because boundaries are unclear doesn't mean that they should not or do not exist. But it does mean that an enforcer needs to step up, hopefully with some boundaries and clarifications. And preferably it's an enforcer and clarifier that is good, both technically and morally. In other words, the moral side of it needs to be built on good technical understanding of what's going on in space, how orbits intersect with each other, for example. I mean, one of the fascinating things about orbits is that right now we're pretty good at clarifying on Earth what borders look like in space in terms of geography and where borders are delineated on Earth. But space introduces the element of time to it also, which is that you can have multiple satellites in one orbit as long as they are not going to intersect each other at some point in time. Or if you have orbits crossing each other, as long as those satellites are not in the same place at the same time, then it's all right. You need to get the technical part correct before you can build good ethical thinking on top of it, and ultimately good legal thinking on top of that. So until clarity may exist, there are a few tools that can be used to think about these things in an ethical way when you have lack of clarity and risk at stake. So here's just a couple examples. So there are 5 approaches to moral uncertainty that come from the history of moral philosophy. This goes back to, I believe, the 15 or 1600s when folks were thinking about these issues. If you have a number of experts who are thinking about a particular problem and the experts disagree, there are various standards of stringency which you can follow in order to decide whether you should side on one side or the other of the issue. So the first one there is minus probabilissimus. One option affirms it, but no others. You have one expert who's willing to say, go ahead, do it, and everybody else says no. So that's a very low risk standard. There's probabilism. A few experts say you can go ahead and do that, but most people are still against it. There's equiprobabilism, which means you have equal opinions on both sides. There's probabiliorism, which means that the majority of people say it's okay, but not everyone. And then tutiorism would mean either that everyone agrees, or you're just going to take the most morally conservative opinion or option that you have among your options. So, and there are examples of this that happen even today. We just don't often recognize that there's a tool to think about these things. So, for example, on climate change, we're basically following a probabiliorism standard here, where most, people say 97% of climate scientists agree on this, that climate change is happening or something like that. So that means that 3% don't agree, but we're going to push them off to the side because we have 97% of people on the other side. On the other hand, technology research and development has a very different standard for dealing with uncertainty and risk. It's basically if one person wants to build a new technology, they can make it. Very often you can't build a new technology with only one person, so you have to get a group of people together to develop that technology, in which case you'll get a few opinions affirm it. Whoever's in that startup or in that group of people who are developing that technology, they have agreed that it should exist. And so that is a probabilism standard. As technologies become more and more dangerous, we might want to ask ourselves whether we want to have more experts agree that this is a safe technology rather than going for this very low risk standard, which is great for technological development, but is probably not great for very risky technologies. All right, there are also 6 different approaches to risk. So that's one tool on the previous slide, and here's another tool. There's the polluter pays principle, which is that you go ahead, you do whatever you're doing, and if something goes wrong, you pay for it. There's the prevention principle, which says if the risks are clear and unacceptable, then you don't do it because you know that something is clearly bad going to happen and it's unacceptable, so you just don't. You can kind of think about that as deterrence if you want to. Usually they don't do it because something bad will happen to them. There's the precautionary principle, which is that the risks are unclear, but if they did happen, they would be unacceptable. So it's a little bit of a more stringent risk standard. There's the gambler's principle, which says don't bet more than you can afford to lose. That makes you averse to the highest risks, but it means that anything that's above those very high risks is still on the table because you can afford to pay for it if it goes wrong. Prudent vigilance says go forward watchfully. This prudent vigilance principle was put forward by President Obama's Bioethics Commission back in the, 2000, maybe 2010, 2011 period. Not exactly sure, somewhere in there. But the basic idea being that synthetic biology at that point should proceed, but with some oversight, with some vigilance. And the last one there is the proactionary principle, which says you need to rush ahead because you're in an emergency situation. So some examples of this standard tech development would be a polluter pays principle or a prevention principle. In other words, if something goes wrong with the technology, somebody pays for it. Or if you think that the technology is going to go wrong, then you don't do it in the first place because there's that deterrence element. Whereas wartime R&D, for example, the Manhattan Project, is very much a proactionary principle that this needs to be completed because it is very important to make sure that we get the weapon before the enemies do. And of course, this comes up to be very risky when there's the question of atmospheric ignition associated with the Manhattan Project. If the first nuclear weapons test had ignited the atmosphere, then that would have been big, harm to obviously all of life on Earth. And that was still a risk that was, even though it was non-zero, they decided to take the risk because they decided it was worth it. And this really brings us to questions of ethics itself in space. And space ethics really raises very deep questions. So, for example, why is the universe the way it is? What's the purpose of humankind in the universe? Is the universe about something, which is the way Markkula Center describes it? Is the universe doing something, which is another way to think about it? Is there something going on here? Are life and intelligence about something? Should humans be doing something? If the universe is doing something, then should we help it or should we oppose it? That becomes the kind of even harder ethical question, right? We might decide, oh, the universe is doing something, but actually we don't like whatever it is that it's doing, so we're going to oppose it. Probably a bad idea since we're a part of the universe itself. We don't necessarily want to alienate ourselves from it so strongly. But once again, still an ethical question. This becomes important because ethics is the path from now to the future. We have where we are now, if you want to think about it. We have the future that we're trying to achieve. We want a good future, not a bad one. And ethics tells us how to get from the present where we are to the good future that we want to be in. If we don't have a conception of the future that we want to have, we're going to wander off, get lost, and not accomplish anything good. And of course, this is a picture. You might recognize it if you climbed Half Dome. These are the cables going up the side. And if this is not a good place to wander off and get lost. And you can decide exactly how risky a situation we're in right now. And it's a pretty risky one, I would say. So views on purpose, we need to figure out what we're supposed to be doing here. Religions have traditionally fulfilled this function to greater or lesser degrees, but the efficacy of religion has weakened with the advent of modernity. It's not necessarily been replaced by helpful concepts or behaviors. So we need to figure out how we can find a purpose in the absence of traditional answers, though these are not necessarily opposed to those traditional answers. I think that there are lots of ways to progress what we've traditionally understood, either as religion or philosophy, in ways that are helpful towards human flourishing, not necessarily in opposition to those older ways of thinking. So there are basically two ways of thinking about purpose. Actually, I'll take that back. There are many, many ways of thinking about purpose, but here I'm just going to go over two of them. There's that top-down perspective and also the human-up perspective. So we can just say to ourselves, the universe seems to be growing in complexity over time, while entropy is also increasing. Does this indicate some form of teleology? Is there some purpose or goal or aim that the universe is aiming for by this growth in complexity and increase in entropy at the same time? That's one perspective. So another perspective could be, so Thomas Aquinas said back in the 1200s, he said, human societies, not all individuals, just society as a whole, have 5 things that they have to be doing. They need to survive, reproduce, educate young, live in society, and seek the truth. He got these by developing some of Aristotle's ideas, and these also show up in many other cultures around the world and in many other philosophies. So, for example, if you read Confucius, Confucius very much emphasizes education and orderly society, for example. Now, if you want to think about top-down teleology, you can think about the fact if you leave hydrogen gas laying around for 13.5 billion years, roughly, it turns into people. This is very suspicious, or at least you could construe it as being suspicious. It looks suspicious to the human mind for some reason, and we might ask ourselves, well, maybe our mind is wrong to think this is suspicious. Maybe this is just normal, and we just don't get it. There's also the human up side of things. So human groups generally seek to survive. They maintain their communal existence together. They seek to reproduce, so maintain their communal existence over time. So you need a next generation to come up to replace the current generation. Education seeks to convey culture and necessary information to the next generation about all these five goals that need to be thought about here. Live in society, you need to maintain order and division of labor necessary for all these five purposes to be accomplished. And truth, you want to keep all those five purposes proportionate with reality. You need to understand what reality is so that you can make sure that your survival, reproduction, education, living in society, and seeking the truth all align with each other and align with reality. Now, in the positive formulation, you might say to yourself, okay, I'm not sure I really buy this. But if you look at it from the opposite perspective, I think it becomes pretty clear. Human groups generally do not seek to go extinct. They don't seek to not reproduce. They don't seek to fail to learn things. They don't seek to be socially isolated, at least in a way that ruins the way a society can operate. They don't generally choose to believe in falsehoods, although this might happen on occasion. When groups choose to do these sorts of things, we might think that they are troubled, perhaps that they're misguided, maybe they're weird, they're crazy. You could also wonder whether they're doing something evil, whether there's something actually really bad going on here. And the evil question comes up if you think about one group forcing this on another. If another group is trying to force extinction on another group, that's genocide. That's obviously evil. If they're trying to force another group not to reproduce, then once again, it's genocide. It's evil. If you're trying to force another group to live in ignorance when they could be living in a more educated environment, that's a form of oppression. If you're taking a group and you're putting everyone in solitary confinement so they can't communicate with each other anymore, that's another form of oppression. And of course, forcing the belief on falsehoods onto people also could be construed as a form of oppression. All right. So to Aristotle, the greatest truths are the hardest ones to find. The human mind seems to be particularly desirous of teleology. So if you read the first, opening pages of his Metaphysics, he goes into these ideas. However, we tend to find it even where it doesn't exist. And this is, of course, a problem. You don't want to be overly searching for something, especially when it's not there, which means we ought to be careful then. These are cognitively attractive concepts, and we need to make sure that we are not seeing them where they do not exist. This doesn't mean we should necessarily stop ourselves from seeking these things. It just means that we need to be careful when we're doing it because we're not sure whether teleology might be there. So seeking teleology seems to be intrinsic to our nature, might indicate, of course, that the universe is interested in the subject too, because we are an expression of the universe. We have evolved here. We are part of the universe. We're the part of the universe that thinks. Therefore, actions which facilitate this effort could be construed as being good. Actions which impede it could be construed as being bad. We might not know if the universe has a teleology, but apparently we do, which is that our telos is something like to seek telei, or teloi, depending on whose Greek translation you're looking at. Humans are not happy if we don't find meaning. It's one of the things that gives life meaning, is to have meaning and meaningful things and understanding what's going on around us. So we probably should seek it, just in case we find something interesting. At least we'll be happy while we're searching for this thing, which we're not sure whether it exists or not. And now we need to go back to borders and enforcement. If our goal is something like determine if the universe has a teleology, and if so, what that is, we might consider doing the following things with regard to space exploration. We want to seek the truth. This requires living in society because we need division of labor. It requires education because we need to have a truth-seeking society. It requires reproduction so that we can maintain our society over time. And it requires survival in order to have any society at all. All those things require a lot of work. They're not simple things at all. So if it comes to exploration, for example, technology provides science. Science provides facts. Of course, those are reciprocal. They feed back into each other so that science makes technology more possible. Good philosophy and religion will take those ideas and utilize them for the sake of wisdom. In other words, what is good? What should we be doing? What more can we understand about reality? Wisdom then provides guidance. So hopefully we can return to the question of borders and enforcement. With wisdom in mind, hopefully we can determine how to reasonably delineate space for the sake of benefit to all. And some of these general rules might include, for example, we should explore space in an orderly fashion, seeking the truth. That requires enforcement of various rules and orderliness. We should work collaboratively, since this is more likely to be effective at achieving the goal. We shouldn't be littering, quote unquote, as kind of a metaphor for the entire project. Don't destroy the preconditions for your own existence and the work that you're trying to do. In other words, don't undermine yourself. Don't fill orbit with debris, or don't do all sorts of other things, whether it be environmental damage or contaminating other planets with, bad, forward contamination practices, those sorts of things. Don't destroy the preconditions for your own existence. Conduct not only scientific and technical research, but also teleological research, making careful not to trick ourselves, or being careful not to trick ourselves, because once again, we're the most likely people to fool ourselves. We're the ones here who are doing the exploration and are most likely to be fooled. So principles, of course, require specification. The above principles still remain too general. They need to be carefully specified. You can think of the Outer Space Treaty as kind of a first pass at this. It very much expresses a lot of those ideas, but in different sort of language, because you can't have this massive philosophical, international treaty. Let the individuals and groups who are involved in making the treaty come up with the philosophy, but the treaty itself needs to be something that everyone can agree on. So it isn't necessarily have a strong philosophical foundation under it, but it needs to allow people to explore those philosophical questions just the same. So while this specification is difficult and it needs to be done, it's way too much for this presentation. So we're getting close to the end. It's absolutely vital work. And without that, it's going to remain the Wild West. So, Clint Eastwood is going to pop up at some point and probably do something. Will it be good? Will it be bad? Will the bad guy get what they deserve? These things are still unclear. And this is just the way things are when you're on a frontier before things have become delineated in the way that they need to be made and delineated. So I just want to say thank you. I'm very open to questions. I'm happy to take any questions. And there's my email address in case you would like to email me. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Brian. I mean, this is fantastic. I mean, I was finding myself feverishly writing notes over here on the side, and I got a lot of maxims here. I think, which is great. I love ethics is the path from now to the future. I definitely I'm going to hold on to that. And probably ask a couple of questions on that relationship between entropy and teleology. Of course, many folks in this audience have read Viktor Frankl, I'm sure, and so I'm sure there are going to be many questions that are related to that. I also like the unclear borders equals unclear deterrence. Especially when we're talking about containment strategy, I think that is absolutely relevant. We do have a couple of questions from our audience here, and I want to thank people and encourage them, please, to drop your questions in the Q&A. It will start off with Mark Meyer's question. He's talking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals applied to space. The first thing that sort of came to my mind was, from at least the DoD perspective, is the SecDef's 2021 tenets of responsible behavior in space. But if I'm framing the question, Mark, right, it's looking at these sort of meta legal rules, and how can they be integrated best into our formal space law thinking, and wanted to hand it over to your expertise for comments on that front.
Yeah, it's a great question, because one of the things, I mean, I do a lot of AI ethics and other ethics of emerging technologies. And one of the things that happens is one group comes up with their principles, and then another group comes up with their principles. And then pretty soon you've got 200 different groups who have come up with 200 different sets of principles. And you have to figure out, how do these relate to each other? What do they have in common? What do they have that's distinct from each other? And how do we make them all work together? How can they play together nicely? So what I would say is that the Sustainable Development Goals are a great way of thinking ethically about international relations, what we should be doing for people here on Earth. There are probably some things that they leave out, although they're quite comprehensive. There might be other things that we might think are overemphasized or underemphasized, those sorts of things. And yet they have large scale buy-in, because they are, from the United Nations. So they should be considered very seriously in how they might relate to what we're doing either in space, or in how they might relate to other regimes for thinking about law in space. What I would say, not having the development goals in front of me right now, I can't necessarily go into them in detail. But what I would say is that I think if you look at those development goals, you'll see how they kind of align with those 5 ideas from Aquinas. And some of them relate to survival, some of them relate to education, some of them relate to reproduction, and the sorts of things that we're thinking about in terms of division of labor in society and seeking the truth and giving people all the capabilities that they need in order to become fully actualized human beings. Now, if you want to compare it to things that are more, defense oriented, those are the good things that you're trying to defend. There are good things about humanity and about the earth that need to be defended. So that's why humanitarian intervention, for example, is considered to be acceptable under certain circumstances, where you can go in and try to protect people who are being oppressed, even by their own government in a sovereign entity. But of course, these are huge ethical questions that don't have simple answers, and they're extremely context dependent. So it's not like you can just abstractly answer a lot of these questions. And this is one of the issues with ethics itself. And it's also one of the reasons Aristotle said there's no such thing as a moral genius. You might have a mathematical genius or a musical genius, but you're not going to have a moral genius, because morals and ethics requires experience, and it requires knowledge of context and how overarching high level principles relate to specific situations. And that's, like I said, just extremely context dependent. You can't solve problems in the abstract. You can only solve them in the very specifics of the situation. So if you had a specific situation, which is why ethics runs on case studies, by the way, if you have a specific situation which you can investigate, then you can apply all these rules and ideas to it. Actually, and just as one last point on this, one of the things we've done recently, we've come up with the handbook basically for corporations to use in thinking about technology ethics. And in that, we have 4 levels of principles. We have an anchoring principle, which says that our actions will be for the sake of the common good of humanity and the environment. That's kind of an overarching anchoring principle. Then you have 7 guiding principles under that. Then you have 42 specifying principles under that. And then at the next level down, it becomes too specific to talk about in the abstract. So if, for example, you say cybersecurity is important, that final 4th level of action principle requires knowing exactly what sort of cybersecurity you need to have in your particular situation. And that's for the organization to decide based on their context. It's not something that can be written in a book. And so if you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, those would be at the kind of the level of guiding principles. And then they'd have specifying principles under that in terms of all the sub goals. And then when you start getting into the specific projects, that's when you start getting into individual cases and how you might solve those things.
Well, and that's great, Brian. Thank you so much for that. And that brings us to our next question from Patrick Lynn. And you may have had a chance to look at it briefly, but his question relates to unethical and illegal actions and how do you enforce it. So there's kind of this enforcement mechanism. Many of the enforcement mechanisms, however, end up causing more problems. So to deal with space issues requires a lot of kinetic actions in space, which causes more space debris in turn. So you even in the cyber context, you have the exact same thing. So Patrick continues, is not creating more debris and a more important consideration than enforcement, maybe for all but most serious violations. That is, in conducting kinetic responses, do we essentially need to be prepared to accept a Pyrrhic victory that denies space for everyone, especially if things escalate? And that reminded me a lot of kind of your enforcement beyond the law, that preferability and enforcement, both in good technically in morale and from a moral perspective, and along with space introducing that element of time. So I'm very interested to see what your thoughts are on that, Brian.
Yeah, this is one of those terrible questions. I mean, terrible in that you don't want to answer it. Not in terms of it. It's an excellent, wonderful question, but it's one of those things that there's not necessarily a clear answer to, because it depends on the specific context. So if someone was filling satellites or filling orbit with satellites that are very bad, I don't know, maybe they have weapons of mass destruction in them, and maybe they're in such orbits that they could EMP the entire planet at once, that would be very bad. You could think to yourself, okay, this is possibly so bad. If this scenario was carried out, all space assets would be destroyed, probably as well as all of civilization on Earth. In that case, maybe the Pyrrhic victory is the one that you need. Space, maybe you need to destroy those satellites through kinetic means and thereby preserve human civilization, even though we can't get off the planet anymore because it's surrounded by debris and dead satellites. So theoretically, I believe there are probably situations where this could happen and where it would be justifiable. However, it's horrible to think about, right? Because this is not an outcome that we want. Ultimately, what you want to do is if you can foresee that there are only bad outcomes in front of you, whether it's 2 bad outcomes or 100 bad outcomes, you want to make sure that you are making sure that you are also leaving open some better outcome. In other words, you don't want to get in those lose-lose situations. You want to make sure that you still have a winning option among all of those. Maybe it's through international relations. Maybe it's through the Outer Space Treaty, which banned the placement of these weapons of mass destruction in space in the first place. So I think that there are options. There are possibilities that we can foresee where maybe only bad outcomes are possible, but the most important thing is to make sure we don't get into that situation where only bad outcomes are possible. That requires a lot of foresight. It requires a lot of thinking ahead. It requires a lot of monitoring and intelligence work and making sure that we understand the situations that we're dealing with. Otherwise, you can walk into these situations. International relations right now is very difficult. We still have good paths forward. However, we can also see that there are a lot of bad paths forward. And the question then becomes is how can we make sure that we're making the right choices so that we are moving towards the good paths and away from the bad paths.
Well, thank you for that. That's fantastic. We'll move to Major Jonathan Sawmiller's question. He's joining us from the United States Space Command, J6. And for those who are kind of new to the way that the system is organized, J6 is that nexus between space operations and cyber. And so Jonathan, I know him personally. He has a great deal of experience in both. So I'm sure we'll probably have some other very insightful questions. But his question is, given the PRC and Russia's lack of transparency and desire to engage in development of space law and UN processes, quite honestly, what incentive do they have to develop or follow any ethical principles in the space context?
Yeah, this is another horrible, great question, horrible question, right? Because it's really hard. If there was a simple answer to this question, people would have come up with it by now. I took an international. I studied genetics as an undergrad, and then I got into ethics at the graduate level. But I did take an international relations class, and one of the things I remember from that international relations class as an undergrad is that wars happen when people don't know which side is more powerful. And so because once again, if it's obvious that you're going to lose, why do you start a war? I mean, terrorism kind of follows that general idea, but even then they think that their goals are possible. They think they're accomplishing something worthwhile. So if we don't know who's more powerful, that's when struggle and competition and war become possible. And so it becomes, if you want to have a situation where you're not having these sorts of things, then you need to make it clear that one side is more powerful than the other. However, that involves all sorts of things related to deterrence, and which shows up in the chapter that Aubrey sent out. So what I would say in this particular case is if somebody's not willing to go along with you, then you kind of have to act as though you're going to go along with what you think is right anyway, which is that you start doing what seems to be the right action, and hopefully people will agree with you and come along with you. That requires a lot on soft power, actually. Do people respect you? Do people think that you're doing the right thing? Does it look like it's fair? And a lot of these notions of justice and honesty and trustworthiness and ethics are very important for that. So if it looks like, for example, the United States is behaving ethically and in a trustworthy manner and in a manner that is worthy of respect, then we will, hopefully the international community will give us that respect. And there will be another number of countries that don't want to go along with it because they have a different view of the future, which is authoritarian and possibly horrible. We don't want to get in a situation where they're, handing out the rules. So once again, if we have a choice between many bad options and many good options, we want to be headed towards the good ones. And then it becomes, if you're actually going to get in a competition, then unfortunately, it comes down to power, right? You need to have more power than the folks who are trying to do the bad things, which is why we have, anytime we're talking about police, for example, there's certain things the police can do, certain powers that they have that individual citizens generally don't have. But if you're dealing with the Wild West, then sometimes you need to hire Wyatt Earp and get Doc Holliday in there and folks like that in order to make the thing happen in the way that it needs to be done. Even if Doc Holliday is not necessarily the most moral character in the first place, you might need to have him on your side so that you can get the overall better outcome in the future. And this, once again, it's one of the great difficulties and sometimes even horrible things about ethics, which is that if you get in a situation where only bad options are possible, you have to choose the least bad option. And not saying, not trying to say absolutely terrible things about Doc Holliday, but sometimes you need to have him on your side.
Well, absolutely. No, it always reminds me of Ender's Game, and I'm sure many have read that book. I read it as a youngster and again as an adult. One of the things I enjoyed about it was the idea of how you win matters. I think was kind of the
Exactly.
underlying option from that book. And I know we're approaching the top of the hour, so I had one question that was sort of on my mind. So I'm a little selfish on this one, but I really liked your section of your book that talked about dual use technologies, and especially with the emerging technologies in AI development, so generative AI, transformers, and sort of that nexus between their use in space, because I think that it goes without saying that we're going to be using, and quite honestly already have been using at the unclassified level, a number of AIs to help with navigation and other types of duties. I wondered what your thoughts were on some of these more emerging trends that have come up in the technological space, and what that means in the dual use context.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the dual use aspects of AI are pretty obvious, right? It's just as human intelligence can be used for good and bad purposes, then any tool that we can create that involves intelligence is going to have good and bad options in front of it. One of the things I guess I would say is that the interesting thing about emerging technologies is that they make the power differential unclear, because you don't know the capabilities necessarily that your opponent might have, and how fast they could develop that, and how quickly they could take their civilian oriented program and shift it towards military, or all sorts of questions like that. And World War II is a prime example of this, right? Roosevelt was building up US industry in order to be that arsenal for democracy. But at the same time, when war actually struck, that's when all of a sudden everything shifted from being domestic, civilian production, and towards military production. And so we can think about that in terms of AI, how quickly that might happen. It could happen extremely quickly. I know folks who are in startups who are working on things like, he calls it automated penetration testing. And I'm like, you're making a company that automates hacking. And it just depends on who your target is. It's the exact same tool. If you direct it towards your own side, then you're testing your system. It's penetration testing. And if you're directing it towards an enemy, then you're just automating hacking into their system. So once again, these dual use possibilities are extremely, they're very real, I guess is the way to think about it. And then it becomes, how do we want to control them? Do we need some sort of international treaty on cybersecurity? Do we need some sort of international treaty on space debris? And the answer is absolutely yes. We need one on space debris. Certainly, I don't do that much in cybersecurity, so I don't want to say whether we need to have some sort of international treaty on that or not. It would probably be helpful. I know that there was a gentleman's agreement, for example, between the US and China for a brief period of time, or at least the media reported it that way. But of course, it seems like all sorts of those things are, they're very flexible. They're very unclear boundaries. And so enforcement becomes very difficult also. And that leads once again to who's more powerful. We don't know who's more powerful unless we're having this kind of constant power struggle. And if it seems like a paritable power struggle, then people are going to say, we can continue this. And if it seems like one side is distinctly, clearly more powerful than the other, then maybe that means that, the weaker side just wants to give up. So these sorts of questions, they go on, and they don't have simple answers.
Indeed, very, very much so. Well, I'm noting now that we're right at the top of the hour here, and so I'll leave it open just to make sure that Are there any other last questions that folks have? And with that, thank you very much, Brian, for joining us. This has been a wonderful talk. And as I said, I mean, I've got a page of notes that I've just taken right here that I'm going to definitely look forward to following up with you on just a lot of food for thought. I in my class I have my students read Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Now Aquinas is going to be added to that list. So so this is wonderful, and thank you so much for joining us here at the Air Force Academy from California. And I'll leave it open just for a couple of minutes, just in case folks have last minutes. But wanted to personally thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to be here.
It's been an honor for us as well, sir. Thank you.